please let us know what you think. Okay, now for the main event, we're very, very pleased to have a presentation again, like I was saying, on redlining, and the presenter will be Braden Crooks. Braden is a founding partner of Designing the We, a social impact design studio operating in community-driven social and economic development. The DWE team designs programs, policies, and enterprises that grow local communities and global networks dealing with deep crisis, from the history of redlining to the future of work. He's on the board of the New York State Sustainable Business Council and has served as the president of the board of Sure We Can, a nonprofit collective for canners, who are those who make their living by redeeming cans and bottles for 5 cents. Braden graduated from the innovative MS Design program and Urban Ecologies at Parsons at the New School for Design in May of 2014 with honors, taught ecological thinking and urban issues at Parsons, and produced live audience webinars about New York, and he's an RSA Fellow. He received his undergraduate from Pennsylvania State University for landscape architecture. In Pennsylvania, he founded Groundswell PA, a community and environmental rights initiative, which campaigned for and passed a community environmental bill of rights in the borough of State College, Pennsylvania, by a popular vote in November of 2011. This is the first instance of rights of nature passed in the United States by using a popular vote. Groundswell helped pass a second initiative on Ferguson Township, Pennsylvania in 2012, November. Braden lives and gardens in Brooklyn, New York. Braden, please join us. We're very happy to have you.
Thanks, Richard, for that very thorough introduction. Thank you so much for having me here, and really glad to be able to walk you all through part of our Undesign the Redline exhibit on a virtual tour. And I can just get started if that sounds good. So let me, as Richard said, I'm part of Designing the We, which is a design studio, and we created this exhibit. Actually, we launched in the Bronx in 2015, and along with April D. Simone, who's the other co-founder of Designing the We, and shout out to her. She's from the Bronx, and we, I'll mention the Bronx again in our presentation. But yeah, since then, it's gone all around the country. We've had several exhibits in the city. Obviously, since COVID, we've been doing mostly virtual presentations, and I'm glad to be able to do that with you all. And we'll look through kind of the history of redlining specifically, but really how it connects to structural racism and inequality in cities in general, and really leads up until today in many ways. And I'm going to be giving kind of a partial presentation, but I'll drop the link to our website where we have the full exhibit actually in a virtual reality format, which is pretty cool, and videos and stuff like that as well. So I'll do that at the end. But I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me here as I do this and I get the presentation started. And Richard, just tell me if you can't see this.
Looks good. You can see it.
Okay. Awesome. So let's just get right into it.
I wonder one question, Victor, before I start, can we expand that all? Because some of it is it possible to make a fuller screen of it? Because some of the typing is small.
No, it's already in full screen.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
I can make it the full image, but it won't.
Yeah.
show
Why don't you do that?
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Sounds good. So just get right into it. Here you actually see there in the middle. This is the first section of our exhibit. That's a redlining map of the Bronx. I actually pulled up while we were early just now Astoria, so we'll be able to look at that in a minute. But redlining maps. Zooming in here, these are issued in the 1930s. So this is actually part of the New Deal. And so this federal government, right, is responding to the Great Depression. We have, also a foreclosure crisis in that era. And the federal government says, we need to step in and refinance mortgages and get involved in the home ownership and home mortgage market, prop that up, basically. And so they're going to they're going to start, they create the 30-year and 15-year mortgage, right? If you're, homeowner, you're probably familiar with that. They're going to be federally insuring home loans, right? They kind of actually really invent the American dream of owning your own home with these policies, because beforehand, if I was, going to buy a house, I might put half my money down or even all my money down, get a 5-year mortgage. This is really going to open up home ownership. But, okay, it's the 1930s, right? So the federal government is actually really explicitly racist, explicitly white supremacist, and they're going to want to bake into all these system structures they're creating, not just home mortgages, ways to cut people of color out of benefiting from them. And redlining is really one of the most consequential. And the way they do that is with the maps. And so the maps are essentially a risk assessment scheme, right? So they start issuing these home loans, and they realize, wait a minute, where you really don't have one universal system to assess risk. So beforehand, if I was, or you were going to get a loan, right, you would go to your banker. Maybe you already have an existing relationship, right? Or they would assess your credit in a relational way. Well, now we're, this is before you and I would have a credit score, right? But instead what they decide to say, let's give everybody's neighborhood a credit score. And that's basically what redlining is. And there's only 4, right? So there you can see there, if you're familiar with the northernmost part of the Bronx, right? You got Riverdale and Fieldston there, right? In green, which is best, right? A green light, definitely lend here. This is an area where we want to see credit flow. Blue, which is second best, right? Pretty good. Yellow, which is sometimes called declining. And then finally red, which are referred to as hazardous areas. And, go down here to the South Bronx, where April grew up, right? You get huge swaths of red and yellow, which is much better. And, these areas are really going to be cut off from availability of this type of credit. But the thing is that because this is issued by the federal government, it's backed, it goes to 239 different maps. So all the cities and basically around the whole country. And, it's going to be feeding into banking practices and discrimination, things like that are already, that groundwork is already laid. And it's going to bleed out. So it's not just going to land on home mortgages and these federally backed loans, but bank branch locations, business loans, insurance rates, basically all type of credit and really access to the money system gets cut off and strangled in these neighborhoods. And this really changes these neighborhoods, because when they're redlined, there really aren't, blighted, empty, abandoned, terrible places, right? Actually, no. That you would, places you might think, oh, these they'd use the word hazardous, right? No, these are full neighborhoods. These are neighborhoods with storefronts and people, and small businesses. These might not be the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city, but they're far from areas that you would think of as hazardous if you were to use that language at all. And so, that becomes that these areas, because they're cut off of availability of these resources, enter a cycle of decline and disinvestment, right? So it's harder to buy and sell a home, so property values decline. It's harder to start a business, so businesses shutter. And these areas enter cycles of disinvestment that will eventually lead to abandoned buildings, the fires, right, and throughout New York in the 70s and 80s, the massive trauma and toll that takes on the social fabric of these neighborhoods, which is tremendous and leads to further crisis, which we'll talk about a little bit, right? It leads to epidemics, it leads to addiction, it leads to, frayed social fabric and violence and crime, things like this. And this is set in motion by deliberate federal policy. And you ask yourself, well, why zone an area red, right? Why do this to a neighborhood? Well, the answer is in the maps. And if you go to what are called the area descriptions, these tell you, these are really the smoking gun. They tell you, why is it red, or why is it yellow, or why is it blue, right? And you go down to line C there, it says detrimental influences. This is for an area in the Bronx. Detrimental influences, Negro infiltration, right? So there's no mincing of words, right? The federal government comes out and says, there are hazardous racial and social groups in America. And we need to know where they are and where they're quote unquote infiltrating, or sometimes they use the word invading. And those places are going to become synonymous with decline and disinvestment. And so, in this era, right, you see the full racial hierarchy established, right? You have a particular targeting of quote unquote Negro infiltration, but then you also have all different groups, deemed as various hazardous people, right? So you have obviously Hispanic Americans, Asian families, right? At this point in time, new immigrant groups that they refer to here as foreign born, right? Which included Italian immigrants, Eastern European, Greek, Jewish people, right? All of whom are in some way or another referred to at this point in time in the 1930s as not white. And you zoom over here, right? They even have a special line D, that denotes the percentage of Negro infiltration. And in this case, right, it's 3%. So it's a sort of one drop rule, essentially, for a neighborhood. And this is a big change because beforehand, if you were a Black family, you might have trouble yourself getting a loan from one of these banks, right? But now so will all your white neighbors because you happen to live on the block, right? You're an infiltrator. And this means it's redlined. So now this is going to spur white flight out of those neighborhoods as white folks flee those areas to get mortgages and the GI Bill and right all the things that are going to go on in suburbia. And that 3% becomes 97%. And segregation, which had been increasing, accelerates. So actually, if you dial back, several decades before even the 1930s, segregation was not predominantly the number one way that racial apartheid in America was enforced. But eventually it becomes more and more segregated. And so you get, even up until the 70s and 80s, it gets worse to what's called hyper-segregation, where we concentrate people into redline neighborhoods at the same time that we're disinvesting and devaluing those neighborhoods. Right. And that is going to be, even though, it's gotten slightly better, it hasn't really. As you may know, New York City still today is the fourth most segregated city in America. And so, this is, really written in black and white, right? As this says, right? There's no mincing of words. And while on the one hand, as I'm saying here, right, you concentrate one group into redlined areas, disinvest those areas. On the other hand, you have this huge spigot of wealth building, which is going to be for home ownership, right? You have the coming of, the explosion of American suburbia, the building out of that whole landscape, right? But that is going to be mostly for white families. And one of the things that they're going to say in these maps is that they are looking for what, in terms of making an area green, they are looking for areas that have restrictions on hazardous infiltration, which means a neighborhood covenant that says this is a whites only neighborhood, or it's in the deed of the house to say you can't sell this house to a Black family or an Asian family, etc. And that means that's good. That's what we want to see, because by preserving racial homogeneity, you're going to preserve property values. And that's the argument made by the federal government. Now, mind you, there was no evidence that they cited for that. There's no evidence that property values were any less because the neighborhoods were integrated. And in fact, the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago did a really great study not very long ago showing that integrated neighborhoods tended to have slightly higher property values at this era, right? But this, nonetheless, despite the fact that this is just invented, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And now that the federal government has created a system for it, it becomes self-fulfilling because now you're not going to be able to get that mortgage. You're not going to be able to sell a house, start a business, right? So that the race, property value, investment, money all gets intertwined. And you fast forward till today, right? And we know that the structural situation created by these programs, even though redlining is made illegal, even though, right, we still, mind you, have lawsuits for redlining in New York State, a dozen a year or so, right? Um, right, it's made illegal. Certainly, the federal system is made illegal, and then it's made illegal later in the banking system, which I'll mention in a minute. But that structural situation that this creates is still the same, right? And the two major outputs are that geography, right, which we see in cities across the whole country, right? Concentrated areas of poverty, mostly people of color in cities, and much whiter, much wealthier suburbs that surround them. And now, of course, we're seeing the merry-go-round go around again, right? And new waves of displacement, and I'll mention in a second, as investment pours back into red line neighborhoods. But the other major impact has been wealth and the racial wealth gap, right? Because what's the number one mechanism of wealth building in the U.S.? It's been home ownership, certainly in the past several decades, and property ownership. From land and businesses to owning people, right? For American history. So not only are we going to cut out people's ability to build wealth through home ownership, but those who did own, right, are not going to see that home after redlining, right, in the decades after redlining, become an asset, right, that they build wealth. No, they go underwater, you lose your money, foreclose, et cetera, right? And so, we've seen the racial wealth gap actually grow in the past decade, especially after the foreclosure crisis, when predatory practices, right, get concentrated once again in redline neighborhoods. And so here you start to look at New York City and the area in general. One thing I want to mention, right, as I'm thinking about it right now, if you do have a few technical questions or clarifying questions for me, please throw them in the chat. Before we transition to the panel, I can hit on a couple of those if there are any. We can obviously just hit them in the panel too, but just in case you have any questions. And put them in the comments, I mean to say. So right here, you start to see just how much New York City is redlined, the difference between areas like Westchester or further out on Long Island, areas of Bergen County in New Jersey, right? But huge swaths of New York City get redlined. And one of the things I'll just point out that you often see, and you can, I will share a link where you can to a site called Mapping Inequality, and they've done a great job digitizing all these maps, and you can check them out more there. But one thing you'll see is neighborhoods, right, redline neighborhoods tend to be in one of two situations. One is still locked in disinvestment, still very much so in the situation redlining created, or two, kind of speculated on, flipped, essentially gentrified, right? And if it's hard to see, I can't zoom in on this, but you'll notice, for example, Tribeca is red on this. Well, Tribeca is not red today, but one thing you'll notice, right, the folks who live there and the people who redlined are no longer there. So what is our question, as always, as an organization? What's the third way, right? How does investment come into a neighborhood that really starts to heal the wealth destruction of redlining? How does the tide? We want the tide to rise, right? But how does it rise everybody's boats rather than washing folks away? And that's where we start to think about systems change and design, which is some of the work that we do, which is going to take bigger policy, and from bigger policy all the way down to community-based projects. But I do want to zoom in to show you, because I figured people would want to see. This is, again, still from the Mapping Inequality site. You'll notice, right, all red through huge parts of a story, and yellow, which really isn't that much better, although it's somewhat better. And this is the area description for D3, I believe, D3 or D4. But you'll start to see some of the languages used locally. You get down to section 2 there, inhabitants. Line C is foreign-born families. It's got Italian and Greek. And then they do have, right, Negro, yes, at 2%. right? So they're very concerned about this. And this is, um, this is going to become a big piece of the justification. They also mention things like industry. They mention commercial waterfront, et cetera. And those are considerations. But one thing you will find is that if a neighborhood, has those qualities, but then doesn't have this quote unquote infiltration, you'll never find it in red. You might find it in yellow or something like that. But the predominant uh, racial elements are still there. So, this, mind you, these are the maps. The maps are issued in 37 and 38. These are issued one time. But they also issue the Underwriting Manual. And this becomes, some people think, even more significant because it lasts longer. And this is going to go to banks and underwriters, and it's asked them to look out for whether or not incompatible racial and social groups are present, to the end that intelligent prediction may be made regarding the possibility or probability of the location being invaded by such groups. Right? So, you know, unfortunately familiar language for our era, but this is very much so going to be infiltrating this mentality and the systems of banking, real estate. Now, mind you, this is how the federal government is talking about this, right? These are the people that we have entrusted to steward our democracy. Well, what about the private real estate industry? How are they going to talk about it? Well, here we have the next slide is going to be this clip this is from a real estate textbook that dates back as early as 1910. So, right, this is some of the thinking that's going to inform uh, the federal policy. And this says, the colored people certainly have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But they must recognize the economic disturbance which their presence in a white neighborhood causes, and forgo their desire to split off from the established district where the rest of their race lives. They refer to that as the property value argument, right? Because if you're a good realtor, you protect the property values of your clients, right? And this is how. And mind you, this is in the textbook, so this would be on your test if you were going to become a realtor. But this is the type of language that by the 1968 Fair Housing Act is going to be made illegal, but it's still very much so, and we know this, embedded in much of real estate. Particularly, you see, for example, if you've heard of the recent investigative journalism and lawsuits going on Long Island for steering and all kinds of things, segregation that's ongoing and out there in Nassau County. So. The good thing is I have some time, so I'm able to kind of spend a little bit more time on this. So this is our timeline. If you see this exhibit in person, which I encourage you to do once you're vaccinated, once things get back to normal, it's 14 feet long. So there's a lot on here. You can see redlining there in red, kind of towards the middle left. Right, and there's a lot, and the reason we have this is because there's a lot that precedes redlining and that informs it, and there's a lot that comes after. Redlining is not the only thing and the only policy, right, that happens. But one of the things that we know is that in each successive era, oftentimes the proposed quote unquote solutions of one era become the crises of the next era, right? And you'll see that through this history, but also that. This transition that redlining embodies, it's one of the reasons why we think redlining is so important to understand, is because it really embodies this transition that occurred from very explicit Jim Crow era racism, where you can read it in black and white, right, where it says hazardous infiltrators, and then designs that into structural racism, right, where it's designed into the geographic structure, it's designed into wealth, it's designed into all these systems. Right, even though that explicit language gets removed, right? Because you fast forward to today, right? And because of this geography and because of all the inequality that this creates, right? You can have different right, different schools. You can have different housing, certainly different healthcare and health outcomes, right? And that talk about zip code, right? Some people point out, for example, that the number one determinant of your life expectancy is your zip code. Okay, and that's because of systems like this, environmental justice issues, this industry siting of things like that, urban renewal, which will bring highways and things like that, often through red line neighborhoods, access to healthcare, right? So all of these things, right, we talk about as separate crises, are very much so entangled in the same history. And we haven't undesigned it. And I think that that's the, obviously that's the title of the exhibit. And right, it hasn't been undone. It's not enough to say, yeah, we're going to stop doing harm. We're going to stop redlining, right? You actually have to say, well, we have to undo the legacies that it created, or we're going to just keep reproducing the same outcomes again and again. So I'm going to zoom through this kind of quickly in the last 5 minutes or 10 or so, 10 minutes. Right, if you zoom back to before redlining, we have, obviously we began this in kind of right after the end of the Civil War. You could go much, much further back. You have First Nations displacement and genocide being really, obviously, America's first kind of play on land. One thing that I'll point out here, I guess I can't zoom in on it, but there's this painting down there. It might be a little hard to see, but it's called American Progress. And it's this image of the American plains. And on the far right side is the sun is rising, and you have New York City, and then you have the trains coming across and frontiersmen. And then on the left side of the image, the darkness is leaving the land, along with, the American Indians fleeing the edge of the image. And the goddess of progress is in the middle carrying a school book, interestingly.
Mhm.
And, what is this painting talking about? Well, it's talking about manifest destiny, but it's really talking about, well, why take the land, right? Why should the land belong to white settlers and not to the indigenous folks who live there? Well, the answer is, and the answer that this painting is trying to portray is that Native Americans are wasting the land, right? They're not using it to its highest and best use. They're not making the most productivity out of the land and profitability out of the land. And land should belong to whomever can make the most productivity and profitability. And this is a really critical idea of land use that comes out of this legacy, right? Because we're asking ourselves a really critical question, which is, to whom does land belong? And the answer could be, land belongs to whomever lives there. But instead, we're going to say, right, it's going to be about profitability and productivity, right? So that you can follow through. And the question, of course, goes back to what we mentioned earlier with, how does investment come into a red line neighborhood, and how do we make sure, and it's a policy question, but also a systems question, that that wealth starts to spread and build for everybody, right? We don't really have those systems yet, in large part. Mainly because people got cut out of home ownership. But anyway, so you follow this, you follow these threads, right? And so you have, I'd like to, we like to mention, we have at the end of the Civil War, we have a period of Reconstruction. And Reconstruction was this brief window where we really could have charted a different direction. You have the first African American elected officials to Congress, large scale enfranchisement, the seeds of Black wealth building that will become, a national Black banking industry, which, by the way, also gets wiped out through the Great Depression and redlining, largely. But also things like Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But that all closes. That window closes, and in its wake, you get Jim Crow, Black codes. You get waves of violence, the KKK, racial terror, right? And that spurs the Great Migration, and it feeds ideas of segregation into systems like redlining. You get scientific racism, right? Eugenics, white supremacy, pseudoscience, right? Saying that incubates it. That's not just a small thing. That's at Harvard and Princeton, right? That is a major intellectual movement in the United States. right? So all of this feeds into the production of massive systems, systems of discrimination, of disenfranchisement, et cetera, that eventually are developed essentially, if you read in Jim Crow or the documentary 13th, right? Essentially try and reinstate slavery in some ways. Certainly Black codes do that by using the convict leasing system, which you may be familiar with, right? Which uses convict labor, um, to put folks right back onto the same plantations that they were freed from. Making all kinds of behavior illegal, right? Loitering, unemployment, and making all this illegal, swooping people up into the convict leasing system, right? So this becomes these systems that even today you could find legacies of. Um, we touch on, and I don't have time for it today, but we touch a lot of the movements that are pushing back on this. And I just want to say, in no time in this timeline are folks taking this lying down, right? And that big pushback has always been there and is obviously there today. And so there's a whole history to tell for that. But right, so this is going to lead us into redlining, right? Jim Crow mentality gets fed into the New Deal. Redlining is going to produce things like blockbusting, white flight, eventually urban renewal, right? With just to zoom back with blockbusting, right? You'll have real estate speculators go into white neighborhoods, flip a house to a Black family, go around, knock on everyone's doors, call them 3 or 4 times a day, say, hey, Black folks are moving in. This means your housing property value is going to, collapse. So you can sell to me at a loss, or I'll come back next week, offer you 20% less, and so they'll buy the house from a white family for, let's say, $1,000, sell it to a Black family for 3,000, right? Triple their money, but then because they don't have access to these federally backed home loans, right, they're going to be using what's called contract buys and other predatory schemes, right, that are only, set up to extract wealth from people. This is a newspaper article from the Saturday Evening Post. It says, would you panic if a Negro moved next door? It said, quote, I'm broad-minded, said one homeowner when Negroes moved onto his block. But a short time later, he panicked and sold his house at a loss. In this week's post, you read how speculators decide which blocks are, quote, ripe for racial change, how they use vicious tactics to force out the whites, and how one speculator brags he could, quote, bust your block in no time at all. In some ways, you can flip some of these words and get to some of the predatory practices you'll read about in gentrifying neighborhoods today that go on. And so this leads into an era of, urban renewal, which I mentioned earlier, right? You get slum clearance. They'll say things like, slums are a cancer on the city, right? So what do you have to do? Bulldoze them. And they'll replace something with things like public housing, right? Institutions and stadiums, highways, right? When public housing's first created, it's segregated. It's just for white families, most of it. And thought of as a big step up. The private real estate industry sues the federal government to say, hey, by providing public housing for white families, and it was mixed income, you're competing with private real estate, so please cease and desist, right? And so the federal government says, okay, we're just going to make it for very low income folks, and it's going to be integrated, but they never fill a funding gap that creates in the whole system, right? And so public housing, even though when it's first created, again, segregated, mostly for just for white families, right, becomes a new area of disinvested housing. And that is a pattern, right, that you'll see over and over again. This, then because of redlining, right, you get the tax base leaving cities, blue collar and manufacturing jobs leaving cities, right? And then you get this era of quote unquote urban decay, right? You see, when New York City almost went bankrupt, right? Lost all this money because there's no money left. And then you get policies like planned shrinkage come out of that. And so in planned shrinkage, you get the city says, look, we don't have enough money for the whole city anymore, right? So we're going to save our money for areas of the city that are quote unquote healthy. and cut off and sacrifice neighborhoods that are quote unquote dying, right? So guess what? It's redline neighborhoods. And places like the South Bronx, places like, redline neighborhoods all over, Brooklyn, it's Queens, right? You have the cutting off of trash pickup, street maintenance, schools, libraries, parks. And the very first thing to get cut, it's actually a smart cities program. It's an algorithm. It's the very first smart cities program in New York City, is to cut fire departments.
Oh, that's true.
And every neighborhood, right, that they do this in is going to burn, right? And here come the fires, right? And now you have parts of the city, like in certain census tracts, for example, in the South Bronx, where 80% of the built environment burns to the ground in a period of about 10 or 15 years. Right? So you physically destroy the city. So do you think that you can take all this disinvestment of financial disinvestment, layer on disinvestment of city resources, right? And concentrate folks still into these neighborhoods and then expect what, everybody's going to be okay? Right? So here comes now all the social crises that erupt out of this, particularly, you get epidemics, you get a heroin epidemic, right? Well, we're in the opioid epidemic today, right? You hear that a lot, talking about that as a public health crisis. Well, not so, right? And this becomes, we're not going to talk about healing, right? And this is a critical moment when we could go in different directions. We say, wow, look how disinvested, how much trauma, how much craziness is going on. We really need to heal and we really need to repair. But instead we get, actually the only solution we're going to approach this with is cracking down. And you get, that being the one tool in the toolbox when we needed many, many other tools. And you get the HIV AIDS epidemic, right? It hits the same neighborhoods. A crack epidemic. There's an excellent documentary about that on Netflix that just came out. A violence epidemic. You absolutely get just tremendous amount of violence connected to the drug epidemics, right? That terrorizes many neighborhoods. And so that leads to, you had churches, right, and and community centers, right, that they'd unravel, families that are displaced. You get, massive evictions. Fires, right, obviously bump people out. And this really, really takes a toll that we haven't accounted for. And again, right, this leads us, right up. One thing to say, okay, I should mention here, there's a big pushback in this era of community organizing, actually starting really with the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, who do clean sweep days to clean up the trash the city's not cleaning up. They do free school lunches. They kind of invent community organizing, a lot of what we think of it today. You also get people pushing for the Community Reinvestment Act, which passes in the 1970s. Really the only piece of legislation that addresses redlining, starts to bring investment back into redline neighborhoods. You get that at least at community development corporations, community gardens, right? So you have this push, right, to say from the ground up, for people say, hey, we need to, reinvest in communities, right? We need to heal communities. That we're in a crisis, and the answer is rebuild our communities, right? And you get a huge push from the top down. But there is a very different push from the top down. It really starts with Nixon. And I want to read this quote. This is from John Ehrlichman in '94, and this is coming from the Nixon White House. And it says, quote, "The Nixon White House had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. We knew we could make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin and then criminalizing them both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." I mean, that's a pretty damning quote for someone who was one of the top advisors of Nixon, right? But this leads into an era, and the key thing I want to point out here is not just, you know, we have broken windows, and the broken windows are real. I mean, that's not there is a violence epidemic, and there needs to be something done about it. But then the question is, are we going to invest back into communities? Are we going to do health and healing? Are we going to do all of that too? But you know, or is this all going to be put on the backs of policing, which really is unfair to the police as well, right? And my question would be, you know, why are the windows broken? And we never really answer that question, right? We don't go back and say, actually, windows are broken because of redlining and urban renewal, and that's what broke the windows, right? And so, without that conversation, you're not going to get the best answers, and that leads us into where we are today. In many cases, where you know we have the foreclosure crisis, as I mentioned before, you have a massive affordability crisis. You know, every homeowner or potential homeowner, for example, may want to build wealth, and a homeowner in New York City is now competing with big national and international real estate trusts that are buying up all kinds of property, right? Um, and it's not really, and it's very difficult to compete with because they just have deep pockets and cash, right? And so that becomes, you know, another era of speculation. Um, you know, and I like to foreground that there's this big difference between people who are going to be homeowners and occupy homes, and people who are running these big trusts, and that's really what's fueling a lot of the displacement and things like that that we see. So you know, this leads us right up until the era we are today. So I'm going to end it there.
Mhm.
Um, Obviously, you know, there's a lot more to add to this story, and there's a lot of angles of it, and I'm sure people have things to say, but I'd love to hear from the other panelists, and I can obviously answer any quick questions about it as well.
Braden, thank you. It's quite a presentation. It's deep and it's wide ranging at the same time. And this is just what we're talking about, how events from 300, 400 years ago, you know, travel forth and they affect us today. And this is one of the main points that we're trying to make here. So thank you for that. I guess I have a question for you before we start is, if you were to look at other societies, if you've seen another society someplace else in the world that would act as a blueprint as far as a direction to go in from your research, is there any that you think is out there?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of people doing amazing work. First of all, just even in the U.S.,
Mm-hmm.
there's folks. We were very proud to say that the exhibit was in Evanston, in Illinois, for their effort of passing the very first municipal reparations, actually, which they're, I think, doing down payment assistance grants with, and so really addressing the history of homeownership issues. I mean, there's folks that are doing community land trusts and even community investment funds, trying to build wealth really broadly and in innovative ways. There's a whole history of co-ops in New York City, which have provided really great, stable home ownership, which is crucial. And you know, there needs to be a lot more housing in New York City, obviously, particularly maybe shifting to some of these models even. And then you know, you certainly have very different, certainly very different looking social housing and public housing models around the world, um, that are, you know, far more successful than our very disinvested model. So you know, I think across the board, I think if the will is there, the solutions are there. Um, but yeah, I think one of the things that we often say is that, you know, if you're not intentionally undoing this history, you're almost certainly repeating it and reproducing it.
Mm-hmm.
There really isn't a middle ground or a neutral ground. It's like there's no neutral on a moving train, and that's definitely the case when you look at these solutions. And nobody has a silver bullet, so there isn't really one answer. It's a systems change answer.
I know it's simple as just, for me, what I've seen recently is I've got friends, young people, you know, I was very, very lucky in the fact that, you know, 25, 30 years ago, I was able to buy a house. But I really don't see the young people around me now, how they're going to come up with the down payments required to get a house nowadays in New York City. We're looking at having to come up with $300,000-$400,000 just for a down payment.
Right. I mean, if you look at, for example, we've done this before. We've done this before. So if you look at the GI Bill, we created very affordable homeownership opportunities, which we don't have, you know, that was largely suburban, but we don't have to, it could be, you know, for apartment buildings and condo buildings in New York City. But those were, you know, one thing about that value of homes, it has to do with the way real estate is being speculated on in the US. And I mean to say it's being speculated on, but not by homeowners, by other people. And the value of those homes in that era was about 1 times average annual income. The average home was about 1 time average annual income, or median, I mean. Now it's 6 times median income, right? So that's just in general, home ownership is much less affordable than it was.
We've had programs, unlike some people that are, last month we had the neighborhood housing Queens, and they were talking about grant programs for down payments and things like this. So there are people trying to create things, but they're sometimes very hard to navigate. Anyways, if I could keep talking, but I would like to bring in our panelists.
Let's do that.
It's important. First of all, I'd like to introduce Bishop Mitchell Taylor. Bishop Taylor is the co-founder and CEO of Urban Upbound, and he's the senior pastor at the Center of Hope International Church. And he's lived around Queensbridge houses for all his life. In 1991, he became the senior pastor there, and for over a decade, he's provided a safe place for hundreds of children and its after-school programs, and fed thousands of families. In 2004, he established the East River Development Alliance, which eventually became Urban Upbound, and in founding it, he created a true alliance of religious leaders, government officials, educators, business owners, and residents, all working together to effect neighborhood improvement in the NYCHA campuses, the local ones, Queensbridge, Ravenswood, Astoria, and Woodside. And it includes workforce development, college prep, financial education, counseling, community revitalization. And in 2010, he founded the Urban Upbound Credit Union, which is, well, according to the conversation we've had now, is the presentation is an effort to, I guess, redesign the or redesign the Redline. He's trying to do that. And I'd like to bring him out. And then also what we have is Stacy Andriadakis. Stacy holds a Master of Science in Real Estate Development from Columbia University, Master of Science in Applied Mathematics from the Corinth Institute of Mathematical Sciences at NYU, and a Bachelor's in Applied Science from George Washington. Her passion for understanding the economic and social dynamics between community and private-public partnerships drives her application of mathematical modeling and answering questions such as how we can better equip our communities with the tools and resources to be their own advocates. Stacy and Bishop Taylor, please join us.
Thank you, Richard.
Hi, guys. Good. So I would like to see if we could start off with some questions. If you have anything that you'd like to bring up to further the discussion on this important subject.
Well, I want to be the extreme gentleman, and I want to say, Stacy, please go first.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Sure. I have a question that I don't necessarily think is outside the topic of discussion, but maybe runs tangentially next to the topic. Obviously, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 made it unlawful to continue redlining practices. However, gerrymandering continues to be an issue at large when it comes to redefining political districts. And as we know, redefining on the kind of funding that neighborhoods and communities receive in terms of their elected officials who may or may not continue to be elected officials. So, I'm kind of interested to sort of hear about what you have to say in reference to that, Braden, because, we did speak with an elected official last week. Richard, am I correct? Or a few weeks ago, and even he really didn't have an answer in reference to this practice being, changed for the better, for communities. So kind of
Well, it is in the new legislation, the voting rights legislation, and ending gerrymandering, I believe, or reforming gerrymandering. So definitely call your elected official to support that, especially those on the fence. The thing I would say is, residential segregation is essentially what makes gerrymandering possible. Because once you concentrate focus right, you're going to be able to draw boundaries around those neighborhoods, and that's really, those things, those boundaries often, you look at redlining maps, you can often find very many boundaries, not just gerrymandering, but sometimes in many places, school districts, different resources that are drawn along those lines. And so it's one of the things that America's segregated landscape facilitates, for sure. Yeah, that answers your question.
Brandon, I would like to ask a question. I think many people that live in the 4 public housing developments in Northwestern Queens, and possibly the 5 developments that we serve in Far Rockaway, and then the 7 developments we serve in East Harlem. But I think that people are asking, what does the modern day quote unquote GI Bill look, of course, without the GI part, but what does that look like for people today?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think that there's going to be multiple pieces, and I think that it's a little bit more. It's going to look like maybe investing in things like co-op ownership, co-op models and ownership through that, and community land trusts. I know I don't know if it is worth getting into, but thinking about, for example, like the project I was going to say community investment, but even things like credit unions and building up wealth. Wealth doesn't always have to happen through home ownership. And you can look at down payment assistance grants. I mean, one of the, as part of the group, the New York Housing Conference, and one of the recommendations was using down payment assistance grants for folks who have been historically victims of redlining, and building wealth with them in home ownership, maybe even bringing in a CLT as a sort of co-buyer and guarantor so people can get credit, but that also, as they scale up, they build the equity and then scale up to another, maybe a second time, with the next family doing first-time home buyer, you can continue on. So I do think, especially in markets like New York, that's going to be vital. And yeah, I think, I don't want to say that I have every answer to that. I think that actually we need to kind of come together around analyzing, how all this could work. And I'm just noticing someone in the comments mentioning they're part of a community land trust. And one thing I'll say, an interesting opportunity perhaps over the coming years, is that there are, we've had a couple years ago now, new rent regulations, or not new, but they closed a lot of loopholes on the rent regulations in New York, and there were speculative investment trusts and things like that who were buying rent-regulated buildings with the expectation they could use the renovations, things like that, to bump them out of rent regulation. And now they can't do that. And on the one hand, there's calls for, getting rid of them again. That might happen for small landlords, I'm not sure. But then with these bigger buildings and stuff like that, it's the opportunity could be that they sell them into community ownership. And there's a program called Pillars to do that. Yeah, go ahead.
Great, that was great. You must have been reading my mind. So here's a broader follow-up, and then I'll let you go into it. There's 178,000 units of housing in the NYCHA portfolio, which stands for the New York City Housing Authority. That's spread over 5 boroughs, 343 campuses. Now, NYCHA claims that our capital deficit is about $40 billion over the 178,000 units in order to get those apartments out of disrepair in livable, safe conditions. Now, the question is, there's been several introductions, plans, RAD, which has a private and public partnership. You know about that. Now we have PAC, RAD PAC, which is another variation of that. Now there's the blueprint. But when you think about the $40 billion and you think about all of these different things that have historically been a part of the public housing portfolio, and here we are decades, families have been lost, children have died because of lead, because of this, because of that. It's just not about stock. It's about, heart and soul, lives and families. Why not give these folks a chance or an opportunity to own that stock? I mean, why haven't we really had serious conversations about, or is that more dangerous than keeping it affordable and rental? My thoughts about that, and our credit union, of course, was built on the fact that my dad said before he died, you'll never be able to make sustainable change unless you own money. And so he said the first message you want to send is that we're not going to wait for people to do it for us. We're going to aggregate people and money and do it for ourselves. So, I mean, theoretically, I would be, an advocate for trying to give people in public housing the largest stock of low-income population the opportunity to build home ownership and wealth in place.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely something that, a model that has to be explored. And I think that, especially when you look at RAD and things like that, and, the redevelopment of lots, the parking lots, it's like, how much of that, where's that wealth going? Who's getting access to that? And I definitely think that ownership models, for example, one model in New York City that was successful was Nehemiah Homes, which you may be familiar with. Nehemiah was a home ownership program, affordable home ownership program that built, thousands of homes. Actually, when the first wave of homes that they built, 34% of the homeowners were coming out of public housing.
Right,
So,
and it was in Brooklyn.
Yeah, it was in Brooklyn,
East
but it
New York.
eventually was all around the city. There was a couple.
Yes, you're right.
And
but
it was led by clergy.
Yeah, Reverend Johnny Ray Youngblood, Mike Geegan from the Areas the Areas Foundation. But what was really historic about that? Remember when they bought the big house to Times Square during you might have read about it during the Democratic convention. I mean, that was the kickoff of that Nehemiah project with the Industrial Areas Foundation, IAF, with Mike Geegan and those guys, and Reverend Johnny Ray Youngblood.
Yeah.
I have a question, Bishop Taylor. That $40 billion capital deficit that's required for, I'm guessing, capital expenditures, right? Basically.
Yes.
Where does that funding come from? I'm actually not familiar with this. I'd just be interested because from a modeling standpoint, I'd be curious to see how you could actually build in that equity to a financial model like that.
Well, that's interesting, Stacey, and that's like a broader, a longer conversation. But I'll say this: that the housing authority is a very complex situation in that, number one, it's federal, sitting in cities, so it's federally owned land sitting, federally subsidized buildings sitting on city property, right? And so it's the federal government's responsibility to add the investment and the subsidies that make federal subsidized housing work. And historically, over the last 3.5 decades, there has been a gross disinvestment, not only in New York, but across the country, in public housing stock. And so a lot of it has
So,
defaulted to cities and states that have said, well, it's not my responsibility, but yes, I guess I have a moral responsibility. So I think that that's what the other thing is, that public housing, as Braden said earlier, which originally was made or developed as a result of the slums in New York City exclusively for white families, uh, has historically, when it was built, it was a shiny nickel, and they put bureaucrats and political figures in charge of it, not realizing that eventually, depreciation was set in, and you actually needed someone that knew about running one of the largest housing stocks in the country. And we didn't have that. Because it was quote unquote public housing, because it was federally subsidized, because there were a lot of, things involved, we didn't have professional housing or rental managers managing this stock. And that is partly to blame for where we are today. We have to say that.
Yeah, one of the things I think about all of these is that what's very important on whatever solution you come up with, governance, and oversight, extremely important in whatever. You can have the most aesthetic name. It could be a community land trust. It could be it's about labels, but if there's not proper governance, there's not proper oversight, it will fail like everything else has failed. So I think that's number one, extremely important. And the other thing, when you're talking about the $40 billion, how much of that money do you think could be reduced by just running an efficient operation? Is that based upon, are they equating in the corruption and the waste that's currently existing within these organizations? Or could that be reduced also, not just by raising more funds, but by cutting costs?
Richard,
well,
sorry.
Let me just answer one question, Stacey. Because I have a PhD in this. That's called a public housing. That's called a public housing degree.
Yeah.
And I got it from Queensbridge University. So first of all, let me just say, Richard, that it is one authority, the New York City Housing Authority. Okay. And so the housing authority itself is responsible for 178,000 units of public housing in New York City, with $40+ billion capital deficit needed in order to bring the apartments back to a livable, safe place for families to dwell. Now, having said that, I would love to live in an apartment that was renovated at the cost of $200,000 per unit. I want to go. I want to go to that apartment, and you know what? Here's the thing. Now, let me just say this. Guess what? All the hell that public housing residents had to live in for the last 3 or 4 decades, you should renovate it for $400,000, and it wouldn't be enough to reprobate them, to repay them for all the pain and suffering that folks had to go through all these years in these apartments. But I'm just saying that my point is that we have to be more innovative in rethinking how we use the public money and the public trusts to create the infrastructure and the stock to deal with what people have been suffering with for many, many years.
One thing I think also in all these systems, we need to start thinking about transparency and accountability from the ground up. How do communities and residents start to participate and understand in these processes? I know with RAD and with some of these others, there's some community engagement and they're thinking about residence committees and things like that. But I think that it's really about reinvigorate. I mean, we talk about this across, not just in NYCHA, but in neighborhoods, the need for new infrastructure to help plan and drive and create neighborhoods. Most often we say most of the time, right, people feel that the only agency that they have or they can have is through opposition. There's very little that people feel like they have a creative agency in their neighborhood, meaning to create and to get involved in what's going to happen next and bring, how are things going to work. And that infrastructure is really a civic infrastructure, and it connects to their, economic development corporation, and it connects to housing, connects to, community planning and parks and you name it, schools, right? So that infrastructure, I think, needs to be really understood, and I think we have the opportunity to do that now. Not, you can look at, virtual spaces and platforms, but also, I do think that we need real on the ground community spaces and hubs where people can go and get involved in this and see how is the money being spent, who's doing it, what is that, how's that working? And I think, one of the things we often talk about in engagement planning is like there's not a lot of trust. It's like shocking. There's not a lot of trust. Look at this whole history. The whole history has been about breaking trust. But I think accountability is even better than trust, because if I can fire you, I'm actually going to trust you more. I prefer to fire you than be able to fire you than just have to take your word for it. And I think that we need those kinds of really small d democracy kind of embedded more. And I think that comes to ownership of wealth, and community ownership and things like that is a crucial piece of democracy in some ways. And then also, the governance systems and how the money is getting spent and who's checking in on it and how.
So, Braden, do you think that there could be a solution that perhaps falls into the technological sphere in terms of bringing these communities both virtually together and also together within actual physical hubs, as you just mentioned?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's both. I think you have to. I really do value the reason we have our exhibit. We do it virtually now, but we love to have it in physical spaces because it gathers people, and people have just different interactions when they're gathering. And they and that's really important to us. High touch, we like to say, not high tech, but high touch. Mm-hmm. Not been a popular phrase during COVID, but yeah, no, I mean, there's definitely you could see, I mentioned earlier community investment funds, and some people are doing some interesting things with that, and how you become a shareholder. There's interesting ways that we can help people become shareholders without needing existing money and capital to throw down on things. That allows us to build wealth altogether, even if you don't have, that's the issue with building wealth is generally you need money first to start. You need a down payment. You need money to buy the stocks, right, or whatever it is. It keeps people out of wealth building. So we need to figure out ways to get people in. And then with the community investment, that's really about investing in businesses, investing in the neighborhood, investing, socially, environmentally, responsibly together. And that people are doing innovative platforms with that. You've heard of like Robinhood and stuff like that, but people are doing stuff that are more about building community together as well.
I guess my question is more also when it comes to something like that, you're talking about policies that use census data as a means of determining funding for a lot of communities, and census data is super outdated, and also it's highly inaccurate because it doesn't really represent the community at large. So how do we get around that? Because it seems like without an accurate estimation of how many people we do need to serve within communities, then it's sort of like the snake eating its own tail, and it just continues in this really.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'm sure that there's 89 more people in New York. I'll go find them.
Yeah, Bishop, you can find them.
He's trying to get on. But yeah, we can, give me a long weekend. I can get you 89 people. But yeah, so obviously that's a big issue. And that being said, as you're pointing out, flawed as census is, it's definitely our most robust outreach that we do on anything. I've been in other places that are, talking about how do we engage people and reach people in planning. Most of the time you hear from the same 5 people. No offense, But you know, you hear the same, you have squeaky wheels, right, about different issues, but you don't hear from the whole community, and that actually is really different. Yeah, I'll give you an example of this. We were working with some folks in LA, and they were coming up with a lot of people opposing the siting of supportive housing for formerly homeless folks. And they were getting a lot of pushback. And people assumed, and in the neighborhoods they were putting in, were particularly the whiter, wealthier neighborhoods. And they assumed, oh, you know, these neighborhoods fight that, and they did, and particularly, you know, older, whiter residents and women who are afraid. And so they actually commissioned a polling company to do a poll of the neighborhood. It was scientifically, you know, just poll, and found that and they just polled older white women who were supposedly the ones that were the biggest against the siting, and found that 75 or 80% were for it. And
I
so,
think one thing that, go ahead.
you know, but then who's showing up to the meetings is not the 75, 80%. So, you know, this is what I'm talking about with small d democracy. It's like that's what's going on.
I think that one thing, I happen to have been on the local community board for a number of years, and I think that it's getting better. Okay, the new borough president has definitely brought it much farther along in terms of diversity, and both age-wise, ethnically, in different ways. So it's much better and much more reflective of the society, but it's still not there yet, you know. And you know, I mean, it may be a thought at some point down the road to actually elect them, because right now everybody's appointed by another politician. So sometimes you may think that they're representing not the community, but the politicians themselves. And like anything else, you can have, you know, like they say, the best form of government is a benevolent dictatorship. In this case, if we have a good borough president, we're going to have a good community board. But then if we get somebody like our last administration in there, you know, that all gets reversed. So, you know, I hope that kind of thing, if you're talking about small d democracy, bringing it down to that level, to the local block level, I think makes a lot of sense too.
I think it's nationally a big thing. It's actually, we're talking about this with the infrastructure bill, and this is like community infrastructure that's missing. Not only in redline neighborhoods and in cities, but in Main Street, you know, America, actually.
Yeah.
Main streets in redline neighborhoods and main streets in small towns that need a different type of investment to come in that's actually going to reach the people who are there, which isn't happening in either case.
One other question. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
One other question. There was an example, of course, in the 2000s, I think, with Clinton, when they started to loosen up requirements for home ownership. And there was a famous quote from our previous mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, who actually said that the reason why we had the 2008 pseudo depression or major recession was because of the removal of redlining. So first of all, I'd like you to comment on that comment of his. And also, if we do go into a situation where we start to loosen up the restrictions, how do we avoid, though, going into a similar situation where predatory lenders come in there and take advantage of the situation so that and everything gets blown up again, which could easily happen?
Yeah. Well, you know, if you look at what happened prior to 2008, what he's referring to is the Community Reinvestment Act and requiring banks to give mortgages to their full district, which includes in redlined areas. And then banks said, oh, you know, there's nobody qualifies, and so therefore, we're going to create subprime. But that's not actually what happened. Well, more than half of the institutions that were involved in subprime mortgages were not regulated by CRA. So explain that. They weren't CRA banks. They were, you know, these mortgage companies, Quicken and Rocket Mortgage, similar. I don't even know if they were or not. I don't mean to say them, but other people too, along with the banks. But I mean, and one thing we know is there were many home buyers particularly Black home buyers who would have qualified for regular mortgages who got targeted for subprime. And the subprime mortgage crisis a lot was taking place in redline neighborhoods. So there is a link, but the link is the predatory systems. I mean, if you go back even to redlining doesn't mean, okay, no, there's no systems there for mortgages. What happens is predatory systems fill the hole that the federal government created. And people need loans, so here come loan sharks, right? So, and that becomes, you know, kind of the legacy. Now, when the last thing I'll say, looking forward, I think that this is why you need to, you know, when you talk about people who've been at the front end of redlining, right? There's a lot of systems that you have to heal. You can't just say, okay, get this. Usually, you know, most of the systems people are exposed to are predatory, or, you know, whether that's payday lending or that's, you know, the way the banking works. I mean, look at this. I believe banks in general during COVID crisis made $5 billion in New York City off overdraft fees. Okay? So it's a lot of money being pulled out of people who really don't have it. Anyway, so I do think that part of it's actually just like, really, we need to get a handle on the predatory things that are going on. And then, you know, yeah, I think that this model, for example, with down payment assistance and bringing in maybe a community land trust, sort of acting as a guarantor, co-buyer, right, who's able to work with the family, secure the land, and then, you know, they build equity, but maybe it's, you know, at a more affordable rate, so that the next time, or there's a model in there where they build wealth, but then the next home buyer of that home is going to remain affordable for the next family. So I think that you can create the models, but I agree, you know, you can't just say, you know, cut people big checks and like not expect predatory people to come in.
Okay, we're running out of time now, but what I'd like to do is if Stacy and Bishop, if you have one more short question you can come up with and to ask, and then we can go.
Yeah, I might have questions for that next, but okay.
Okay, good. Well, please do. Stacy?
Well, no, I was just going to sort of discuss the valuation process when we were talking about the 6 times median income versus the 1 times median income, and the National Association of Realtors, who sort of have a very heavy lock on the valuation process across the country. You know, the valuation process of homes, especially within the residential market, is an extremely flawed system, and it really hasn't been changed, which in part is due to the heavy lobbying on behalf of the National Realtors Association. So one of the things that, you know, should be taken into consideration, and I'd love to hear your opinion about this, but from my perspective, as someone who's seen the numbers on this and done evaluations way more times than I would care to admit, you know, how do we really start to combat that when there is such a heavy lobbying group behind the National Realtors Association, so that people can not only have the down payments for the homes that they would like to buy, but also have fair housing prices?
Yeah, it's a Gordian knot a little bit, because obviously, right, on the one hand, I you know, you don't want to say, oh, let's limit the wealth building of one group of people, and you know, and then if you have more money, you get to play on the market, and you know, that's a whole nother question. I do think, though, that the way the system works now is essentially it's cut out most people, certainly in our market, most people. So we need affordable home ownership options, but and you know, even an affordable home ownership option, you're going to build wealth. In terms of valuation, yeah, I mean, that's something you might know more about than I do. It sounds like you do know a lot more. What to do about it? I think that we have to open that whole can of worms up. The way that land value gets assessed, you know, to your point about fair housing, there's an example in Chicago where a black woman, put her house up, had her house assessed, and she found that it was assessed for, I guess, the same price she had bought it for a few years before, and then she removed herself from the assessment process, took down all the pictures of her, and had another assessor come in who evaluated it for $80,000 more. Right? He doesn't know it has a black homeowner. I mean, that's a real thing that goes on, and apparently there's something like $20 billion in black wealth that's associated with just mismatched home assessments. There's also the financialization of the whole thing, and all of the players from banks who are making all this money off of mortgages. You know, one thing about wealth building and home ownership, most of the wealth goes to the banks. Okay. And then the real estate, brokers, all this. So there's this huge industry built on extracting a lot of wealth from home ownership that it's a systemic problem. That's why we have these systemic problems.
Mm-hmm. And Bishop?
No, I think that, we Braden covered, a lot of the things that, in his presentation that was, I think a lot of people think about all the time, and, it's really been, a compounded problem over time, and trying to unwind the red line is, an ongoing effort, I think, and I certainly want to support that. I really get very incensed when I hear the history recited again and again and again as it has retarded, black and brown wealth historically. And so there's much more to be said about that. I hope that I'd love to get have further conversation with you, Braden. I'll get your information so we can continue to talk. And but no, thank you so much, Richard.
We can always bring the exhibit to Astoria sometime soon.
Awesome.
Yeah, actually, when you get the physical presentation up, maybe we can find a place to actually put it up around on the waterfront down there.
Yeah, we do. When we bring it places, also we do a process of localizing history and getting stories and stuff like that. So if people have local histories to add, that we can add them in.
Yeah, it's important that the people that live here, they're living in the present. They don't know what's going on in the past, and it's real important to establish those roots in order to grow. So that's one of the goals of what we're trying to do. So thank you so much, Braden. That's a great presentation. And a lot to think about. And listen, if anybody has any comments or anything that they weren't able to ask, you can email us at info@oana-ny.org, and we'll get you back an answer. Okay. So also, stick around. Our next part of our program, we have a tradition. I'm a musician by trade, so we have a tradition of bringing a performing artist out for every meeting that we have. And this one's particularly interesting for me because it's the music of the part of the world I come from. And we're going to be having a presentation of music from North Africa for about 10-15 minutes. So stick around. And thank you very much, everybody. And then along those lines, I'd like to introduce Rashid Halihal, who is from Fez, Morocco, and he plays the oud and the ney and sings, and he imitates famous singers. He went to school at the conservatory